Hello everybody, Father Jim Barron here. Thanks for tuning into this Fireside. Today we have a very special guest. We are honored to call him a parishioner, and I'm blessed to call him a friend, Mr. Eric Kniffin. Eric, he is reputed as a national expert on First Amendment and religious freedom litigation. He has done a lot of great work with the Department of Justice and the Becket Fund. Most importantly, he's married to a wonderful woman, Bonnie, who, by the way, one of our parishioners met her in the parking lot, sent me an email afterwards saying that she just met an angel. Bonnie is a wonderful woman, and Eric is very blessed. And they've got 8 wonderful kids, and they're here at our parish. You see them at Masses. But I brought him in especially today because of a topic that I've mentioned a few times on these fireside chats that really should concern us all as Catholics, the Equality Act. That's a piece of legislation that's going forward in Congress that the President has promised to sign up for if it's passed. And I think we need to understand more what it is and why it's such a big deal. And so Eric has generously volunteered his time to come on to today's Fireside and help us understand a bit about that. So Eric, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Father.
In your own words, what is the Equality Act?
So the Equality Act is a bill that's been around for a while. We've seen it come up in 3 or 4 Congresses, and so over the last 8 years or so, it keeps on coming up. It did pass out of the House in the last Congress, and it has already passed out of the House again in the most recent, the current Congress that started in January. So this is a law that, I guess the simplest way to describe it is it takes federal civil rights laws, and there's a lot of them, and it adds sexual orientation and gender identity to them. And so that's the simple way to think of the bill. It's certainly how it's presented, as simply updating federal law to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And that is true from a certain point of view. That's what a lot of the law does. If you look at the changes that are made, it's insert the phrase sexual orientation and gender identity here, here, and here, and here. But the effect of it is much broader than that. And that has to do with the way that federal civil rights laws work. So some laws, particularly those that have the category sex in them, already have pretty good religious liberty protections. So Title IX, which covers schools that get federal funding, has an excellent religious liberty provision. Title VII, which covers employment, has awfully good religious liberty protections as well. And so when those laws are changed, it doesn't make that big of a difference. But there's other laws that are updated that don't have sex in them right now. So several of these laws only cover race, color, and national origin. And you think, well, you know, those are really the core issues in the civil rights era in the 1960s. And there was a clear message sent there that says there's really no room for those sorts of bigots in our society. And so the laws, as you'd expect, those laws don't have basically any protection for religious liberty. And so when those laws are updated to put in sex and sexual orientation and gender identity, it's a whole different ballgame. And when you look at it from that perspective, the Equality Act, if it became law, would radically change the, it would certainly change the legal prospects for organizations, including parishes and religious schools. And I think another important thing, the law really also has an important cultural effect in changing sort of what is acceptable as normal, what is acceptable in polite society. And I think Equality Act is designed to, by its proponents, help change the conversation in society and says, look, if you want to be a member of polite society, you don't mention these issues, you don't stand up for these convictions.
Sure, okay. So it's regarding how people identifying as either the opposite from their birth sex or identifying as same-sex attracted would have legal protections. Doesn't it also include some protection or promotion of taxpayer funding for abortions? Or is that part am I confusing that?
It is in there indirectly, and okay. So it's sort of a hop, skip, and a jump away. And so nothing in it says abortion, but if you consider whether or not you fund abortion, if you consider that to be discrimination on the basis of pregnancy or discrimination on the basis of sex, that gets added in and sort of through that door it would be interpreted down the road to require abortion coverage.
Okay, understood. So somebody might ask, well, Christians, aren't you supposed to not discriminate against anybody? With the enfranchisement of these specific qualities or identity markers into law, it would seem to not be so much to try to protect somebody from discrimination. It almost seems like a way to weaponize or leverage against religious organizations. I guess let me elaborate my point a bit. On the one hand, certainly every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, and we owe them a treatment of respect and love, even if we profoundly disagree with them. What this seems to do on the one hand is to open a lot of avenues for very irregular and potentially dangerous situations. For example, in homeless shelters, which traditionally would have men's and women's separate, this would make it now illegal to define that separation, preventing a man who identifies as a woman with no further questions asked to be able to then go and stay in the women's sleeping quarters of the shelter, as an example. Same thing with collegiate sports, even high school, middle school sports, locker rooms. So those are problematic because on the one hand, I hear a lot of confessions. I know what human nature, how it works, and that could be very dangerous for women who have been traumatized in abusive relationships, now staying in shelters, who all of a sudden have to now sleep next to a biological male. But as Catholics, we also recognize that human nature as created by God is a given. And it seems funny where so many people have said, trust the science in every other area of life, are willing to ignore it here. And so when somebody is scientifically proven to be male or female, ideological gymnastics aside, that's being ignored now. So the science doesn't matter, it seems. But Catholics, we recognize the importance of truth and science and the human nature in this. So it's not so much about discrimination as being able to proclaim a truth that is true. Science backs it up. We can look to divine revelation in Scripture, but we also have the backing of natural law and reason behind us. But this now would muzzle that. And so it seems to be not so much about protecting a particular group of people, but almost silencing any opposition.
I think that's right. As the Catechism says, unjust discrimination is wrong, no matter who it is. And so, certainly our faith does not give us license to treat people poorly because of something they're struggling with. But this really does go beyond that. Just to take in the medical context, this debate has been going on for decades. The idea that Catholic hospitals were going to discriminate against people because they're HIV positive. And it's this trope that gets thrown out there, but it's never happened. And doctors, they're very, very clear and focused on this. They're like, look, we are not going to be, part of sort of enabling someone to go out there and sort of commit murder or something like that. But if someone comes to us and they're sick, we're going to treat them because they're sick. It doesn't matter who they are. And I think the same thing is true here. The debate over how someone like Jack Phillips up in suburban Denver runs his business as a Christian who makes wedding cakes. This is not about him saying, I'm not going to sell you anything because you look gay to me. This isn't about someone who runs, a Catholic who runs an auto repair shop saying, I'm not going to change your oil because you're holding your partner's hand. This is limited to very specific scenarios where Christian business people or the church itself is saying, look, we can't affirm this. We're going to make a distinction here. And the document that came out from the CDF just yesterday, which Pope Francis affirmed, saying, look, we can't, as a church, be blessing sin. And we have to, as part of our public witness, saying, I recognize the image of God in you, but there are certain things I can't affirm. There's certain things I can't sort of equivocate between. And that's where this law is really dangerous if it became law. And so for someone who is transgender, it's not just what bathroom they use, but it's even being an environment that's saying, look, if you articulate Catholic teaching in this person's presence, they can claim this is creating a hostile work environment for me, and so that they have a federal right to be protected from the church's teaching, even if they work in a Catholic school or in a Catholic parish. And so the nature of these things, it really is insidious, and it really would have the effect of changing and making it dangerous for Catholic entities to operate according to Catholic teaching.
Sure. Yeah, I've never considered myself much of an alarmist. In fact, I tend to sort of try to find the reasonable middle ground with most things, but I have been quite alarmed with the accelerated, cancel culture is a good example, but the accelerated move to silence opposition. It used to be where people who were on either side of the political spectrum, but especially on kind of a more liberal self-identity, prided themselves on being able to have open conversation about just about anything, and that seems to be less and less possible anymore. And granted, there are a number of sides contributed to by both, or a number of factors that both sides have contributed to that have broken down conversation and dialogue. But now it seems to be a hard turn towards silencing opposition. You hear organizations, I was listening to NPR, which I don't recommend if you want to keep a level heart rate. Unfortunately, they tout themselves as being unbiased and neutral, but they had this whole news spot effectively telling people how to cancel conservative news organizations, how to defund them. And that should really bother all of us, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on the one hand, because then it just reduces it to sort of naked aggression and power, and it becomes a power struggle, which never turns out well. But freedom of thought means that your thought should be able to be challenged, whereas this seems to also have that, as I mentioned, I use that word weaponized, a weaponization against a voice that doesn't agree with the direction of the culture. And the language of bigotry and sort of how people throw around homophobic and transphobic, these are kind of phrases that they're emotionally charged that don't have much intellectual content, because what do they mean necessarily? Now, certainly, somebody could be aggressive and violent against any particular group of people, and as Christians, we would stand with that victimized group of people. But we recognize that sometimes this language is used itself as a hidden weapon, as a form of, if you will, violence. I mean, not to use a concept that's thrown around too easily in conversation as if words were violent, but it does have an ulterior motive, it would seem, to particularly silence religious organizations that don't agree with the cultural thrust. Just before we started filming, and the last thing I'll say, then I'll turn it over, we mentioned a few sound bites from prominent and influential people that see the showdown between sort of cultural progressivism and religious freedom, that religious freedom needs to lose. And that's, I think, what we're seeing in this, is that opinion of, if you're not on board with where we're going with this ideology, then you just need to get out of the way and find yourself in the dustbin of history.
Again, this is not about whether or not we as Catholics and we as Catholic institutions should love people who are dealing with these issues, people who find themselves same-sex attracted, people who are struggling with their gender identity. The issue is, how do we love those people best? And as Catholics coming from a Catholic anthropology, we have a different set of diagnoses and a different set of answers for how to love and how to care for these people, and have a different sense of what God's will is for those people than our society does. And that's part of the short-circuiting of this conversation, is no one who's really looked at these issues would say that gender dysphoria doesn't exist, that people don't have confusion on this. Yeah. But the issue is, what's best for these people? How do we love them best? And to have government shortcutting that conversation and saying these types of solutions or these types of approaches to these issues is hate speech and is illegal, is really dangerous and troubling.
Yeah. So, who knows, worst case scenario, we always hope for the best but plan for the worst. Say this passes. What could we expect?
Well, I think there's going to be changes for us as Catholics and for Catholic organizations at the legal level and at the cultural level. At the legal level, there will be litigation brought by the federal government, where I used to work in the Civil Rights Division, and in society more broadly with ACLU and other advocacy groups, using this law to try to shut down conversations and trying to change society to push religious organizations, religious people into silence. So there certainly will be a lot of that. So at the cultural level too, that not everyone's going to get sued, but the effect of a law like this and the litigation that comes with it is to create a cloud that changes conversations, that what's polite discourse in politics, in professional circles, what I'm able to say as a lawyer, what medical professionals are able to do. So the goal is to use the law in order to change what people can discuss in polite society. Another aspect of this is that not only does the Equality Act not include additional religious liberty protections, it would be the first law in history in almost 30 years that would supersede a law that's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's, the Supreme Court called it last summer a super statute, because this law automatically applies as another layer of protection over other federal laws unless Congress specifically says it doesn't want that law to obtain. And Congress has never done that. And so were the Equality Act to become law, it would be the first one. And so that creates a new situation for lawyers like me who defend religious organizations. Fortunately, we still do have really great protections under the Constitution, the First Amendment for religious organizations. So a lot of the litigation will move there. But it will, I think, be a real important marker in our society would it become law at a legal level and at a cultural level as well.
Sure. I mean, there's so many notions that people have that aren't law, but that still affect their behavior. You know, how many people think you can't talk about religious questions or God in public forums or schools, but because that mentality of, well, this must be illegal, so we can't talk about it. Well, now that it would be illegal, how that would even be, how that would much more drastically affect people's behaviors. Big considerations. So let's talk about some things that we can do right now, certainly as Catholics, but hopefully of people that recognize just the danger of this as a whole. I've noticed some secular news sources running editorials and even headline pieces about really seeing this as problematic for a number of different reasons, even though they're not religious. So, you know, hopefully, again, not just Catholics can recognize this is something we got to pay attention to. So let's talk about some things that we can do in the meantime.
So one is to write your senators. So this is already passed out of the House, and so the fight it's at the Senate level right now. So write your senators. If you want help doing that, there are organizations that have helped sort of get your message in the right direction, and they also have draft language as well. I think some of the groups that I follow closely and recommend on these issues, one would be the Alliance Defending Freedom, another is the Beckett Fund, where I used to work, and then also the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is a think tank in Washington, which operates from a Judeo-Christian perspective, but a lot of the leading people there, including their new president, is a Catholic, and they do a lot of great stuff in these issues.
Great, and we'll include some of those links with this feed, so please check those out and make sure that you do everything you actively can to influence and take part in the legal system and our voting system. And voting does matter. You know, please, when midterms come up, the next presidential election, it matters. Remember these kinds of things and pay attention to what people, one, say they're going to do, because this was adverted to all throughout the campaigning season, and you know, we shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves here. But you know, if you are in a position to run for local office and support people who are, you know, who share certain constitutional values, just the basic freedoms that we should all enjoy as Americans, you know, please consider supporting them. But pray. As Catholics, we pray, and we recognize that yes, this nation is not our home. Our eternal home is beyond this life, but we do try to be good citizens and good stewards while we're here. So please pray for our country. Pray for the conversion of the people who are actively trying to work against religious organizations. Pray for the people who are just kind of their instruments and unwittingly cooperating with all of this, that they might come to know and understand the consequences of what they're trying to work towards. But we also want to, in a special way, become very informed and have conversations, informed conversations about this. The last thing we need is Catholics sort of emotionally reacting and overstating or exaggerating things, but there's little exaggeration with how dangerous this really is for us as Catholics and as people who believe in God and want to exercise our God-given right, let alone constitutionally guaranteed right, of freedom of worship. So inform yourselves and have conversations with people about this. Share this video with them if you find it helpful, and then share other resources amongst each other, amongst your family. Remember, it's not about trying to not protect a certain marginalized group of people. As Catholics, we serve them, we love them. In my seminary, one of the most privileged times that I had was serving at an AIDS hospice for primarily homosexual men. And one of those men grew his nails long, grew out his hair, wanted to be called Deborah. We loved him just the same as everybody else. It's not about trying to keep us, it's not an exercise of bigotry towards people who are struggling with one thing or another. It's ultimately about our freedom of religion and the ability to freely proclaim the truths about the human person and to exercise those in our own communities and in the ways we serve through Catholic charities, adoption agencies, shelters, things of that nature. So check out the links below, pray, become informed, and do everything we can to truly try to be salt and light for a world that seems to be increasingly dark by the day. Well, Eric, thank you so much for everything you do behind the scenes. He's a great advocate for these things and a wonderful resource, not only for the church, but also in the secular world. So we're very grateful to have you on and for really being able to call you our parishioner. Very proud of you.
Father.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you.